Greetings, friends. As we approach this weekend, I want to talk to us a little bit about Paul in his letter to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. Let me read it to you, and then I want to just make a few comments and give us some things to think about. Paul says these words, "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing." Now that word perishing is in the active voice in the Greek, so it's a state of perishing that's going on continually. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Now, being saved is also in the active sense. So every time you say, "I'm saved," you're actually not telling yourself the whole truth because you are being saved. You're not fully saved. You've got to endure to the end to be saved. And so Paul says the word of the cross, the message of the cross, is foolishness to those who are perishing, but it's the power of God to those who are being saved. So now we've got perishing and being saved, but you want to be really careful. Even John Calvin said we can't be sure which category we're in at any given point in time because all of us are facing a battle in our own souls between good and evil. Yes, you have been redeemed from sin's power, but not from its presence, and there are times where you can find yourself giving yourself to a place of, I got to save myself, I got to deliver myself. And that's when you begin to perish, because the moment you seek to save your life, you start losing your life. So Paul goes on to quote Isaiah. He says, "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the understanding of those who have understanding I will confound." So now God says he's at war with corrupt wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but God Almighty is at war with the corrupt wisdom that came to entice Adam and Eve at the fall and has governed the way in which we live our lives. So he goes on to say to the Corinthians, where's the wise person? Because see, in Corinth, they valued worldly wisdom. In Corinth, there were people in the church that thought they knew more than anybody because they listened to all the worldly philosophers. They listened to the orators, the motivational speakers of their day who were skilled in rhetoric and could use words to convince you that what they were saying was true. But if you listen deeply and learn to question, underneath those words of rhetoric, those persuasive words of rhetoric, you would find their argumentation was weak, because even though a motivational speaker tells you, if you do what I say in the next 21 days, your life will be changed, honestly, it won't. Because unless they're talking to you about real transformation from the cross, you're just deceiving yourself. You're being manipulated, which is why we need to understand that the words of men's wisdom will fail us when it comes to facing the real battle between good and evil. Where is the wise person? Where is the scribe? Now, the scribe is related to the Jewish community because the legal authorities in the Jewish community were supposed to be the ones who had wisdom. But Jesus says to the scribes, you've heard it said, but I say to you. So here's the wonderful counselor letting them know who is the wisdom of God. Christ is the wisdom of God, saying, this is not the reality. There's a greater reality. Where's the debater of this age? Now he's talking to the Greeks. Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? Well, now you got to ask yourself, how did God make the wisdom of the world foolish? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. Well, what's the message? It's the cross. It's the cross. It's Christ crucified. For indeed, Jews ask for signs, and Christ search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, a stumbling block, to the Gentiles, foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God, Christ the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than mankind, and the weakness of God is stronger than mankind. Think about the God who created the heavens and the earth and the entire universe. When he decides to reveal himself to us, he becomes fully human and dies in weakness and vulnerability on a cross. So for Paul to say God reveals himself in weakness and vulnerability is offensive, to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. This is not what life is all about. We would rather hear oratory and rhetoric. Meet all my expectations and grant me all my entitlements because I want to win and I'm going to preserve my life no matter what. Now, if you think that just goes on amongst those who are perishing, I promise you, we have in the church a steady diet of win all the time that has very little, if anything, to do with the real message of the cross. God chose an instrument of torture and death to reveal what he's really like in terms of his vulnerability and his love. The paradox is that the cross doesn't make sense to our flesh. God's power is revealed in Christ's seeming powerlessness at the cross. When Isaiah experiences the coal touching his lips, his rhetoric, it's his heart that the cross is going to mark itself on, because rhetorical skills of the world are not faithful speech. And a matter of fact, the more you listen to great motivational speakers, and I have, and I think there's a place for motivation, the more you discover you can get caught up in this to the point where you really never change. You just think you're changing. In Corinth was like the Vegas of our day. What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. On one end of the city, you could have gone to hear all the great motivational speakers. On the other end was a temple with 1,000 temple prostitutes where you could have orgies all day and all night long. And in Corinth, new movements were born by the skill of rhetoricians who could talk you into believing anything. They could talk you in by their clever skills into thinking something new is happening. This is your day for everything to change. Really? Really? Oratory can be really seductive, which is why Paul, when he says he didn't come in the persuasive words of men's wisdom, Paul could have used rhetoric, because Paul uses brilliant rhetoric even in his argument here in Corinthians, but he doesn't use it the way the Greeks use it. He understands. He's been trained in rhetoric. He was trained in the University of Tarsus. He was one of the prize intellectuals of his day, but he counts it all loss because he's been brought to a place of humility so that even his words have to be marked by the cross. Paul's lack of oratory is not lacking at all, but what Paul does is he models the cross, even in his words and the way he speaks, because he wants those who listen to him to gain Christ and face their own weaknesses and vulnerabilities. See, there was a day when there were all sorts of things tied to clothes make us who we are, dressed to impress. Oratory is like that. We can dress you up with words, but it doesn't mean that what's lying underneath your clothing is still pretty. Because the more you use rhetoric to make your argument, the less your argument is cohesive. The gospel isn't about sounding pretty. It's about changing our lives at a radical level where we end up realizing that the wisdom of this world isn't going to help us deal with the evil that so easily can beset us. The cross shatters all of your and my expectations of power and winning, because the cross lets us know where the battle is. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And you can stand maybe for a month or 21 days on the motivational speaking techniques, but your knees are going to get weak, your thighs are going to get weak, and you're going to have to sit down. But if you're going to, having done all, stand, that means you've got to be grounded in the cross, because there is no fellowship, there is no power of resurrection apart from the fellowship of his sufferings. Resurrection ground is the cross. I've got to be grounded in the cross-shaped life. And here's the thing, we are being saved. We're also, therefore, still battling the perishing realities of what's going on that are warring against us. And so when we realize that the false wisdom of those who are relying on rhetoric is really about perishing. I remember when the TV show Fame came out. Fame, I'm going to live forever. I'm going to learn how to fly. We're not going to live forever. We're going to die. Now, in the eternal dimension of salvation, we will live forever. But salvation in the Hebrew is way more than what happens when you die. The word for salvation in the Hebrew implies being set free from cramped quarters to live a fuller life. And the fact is that the more we seek to preserve our lives, the less full our lives are, because we are allowing all sorts of inner frustrations and battles to hide us from the fact that death is inevitable. False wisdom offers false protection about a lot of things. That'll never happen to me. I've lost many friends this year to COVID. Many of them were actually quite healthy. They didn't have any of the conditions that would make them more prone to COVID. I've lost a lot of friends, and my heart has grieved this year. Listen carefully. When you say that'll never happen to me, what makes you think you're more privileged than anybody else? Because you have skilled oratory? You think that because you decree it enough, you can have it? Is that what you really think Jesus taught? That there are the elites among us who get everything they get because they have some technique? Paul doesn't say, what shall deliver me from this body of death? He says, who? This is a relationship with Christ. The potential for good and evil is ever present in your life, and it's ever present to the point where you, whether you realize it or not, have a capacity for evil. Your strength isn't strong enough. Your self-talk isn't sufficient enough. Who is going to deliver you? If you want to be set up for failure, deny your own tendencies towards self-preservation, which are ultimately destructive, and stay ignorant of your weaknesses. Deny they exist. Shove them down so deep so you don't have to own them, but they're going to come out of those graves as ghosts and be thrown on other people that you're going to say, that's your problem, when in actual fact you're looking at a reflection of yourself that you disowned. You're judging, not realizing you're being judged. And those ghosts will come back and haunt you for a long time until you decide to realize and own what's going on inside you that's causing you to disown your own weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Beloved, it takes the cross to face up to our weaknesses and the darkness that hides all of that inside of us. The impulse to preserve our lives runs deep within our veins. So the great question is the Dr. Phil question. How's it working for you? We're living in a day where I think God is calling us afresh to humility and sobriety, so that the real joy of the Lord can become our strength, so that the reverence of God can be the foundation for what the wisdom of God is all about. Not the wisdom that's from below, which is earthly, sensual, and demonic, but the wisdom from above, which reveals the character of Christ. Peaceable, pure, gentle, easy to be received, full of good mercy and good fruit, sown by those who want to make peace. That's Christ. That's the wisdom of God himself. That's not an easy road to hoe, because James tells us that we have a tendency to want what we want and will war for it and even use our words to kill for it. We wage war, and so we don't get what we want, so we fight and kill to get it. He says that's not the wisdom of God. That's worldly wisdom. But James is talking to us, and he's letting us know you're living a limited, cramped life. Christ came to enlarge your borders, to increase you from the inside out. But you got to get the ghosts out of those graves and let them go. Otherwise, you're never going to love your neighbor, because you can't love your neighbor as yourself if you have divided the world into us and them, where you win and everybody else loses. Christ wants everybody to win. And the sooner you and I realize that, the more we're going to start laying our lives down for others, so that they can come to a place of freedom as well. I know this isn't popular, what I'm saying, but I got off the rhetoric train a long time ago, and I can't get back on because the Lord won't allow me to. And at this season of my life, there's a sobering reality that Christ is calling us to, that I believe needs to be voiced. And that is that the cross of Christ is the power of God, is the wisdom of God, and that if we want to save our life, we'll lose it. But if we lose our lives for his sake, we will be set free from cramped quarters. I pray you have a great weekend. If you have no place to worship, join us on Sunday mornings online at COTLE Orlando. I believe you just might be blessed.